Ruby Bridges by Leslie Faber, illustrated by Mary Charlotte Avier. Ruby Bridges by Leslie Faber, illustrated by Mary Charlotte Avier. Ruby, honey, it is time to get going, called Ruby's mom. Her voice cracked a little, sounded higher than usual. Do not forget, today is a special day. Yes, Mom, I know, said Ruby, looking at the calendar. Today was November 14, 1960. Ruby tied a white ribbon in her hair. She smoothed the front of her best white dress. Then she skipped down the stairs. Today, Ruby Bridges, age 6, was starting first grade. There was nothing special about a 6-year-old going to first grade, but Ruby Bridges was black. She lived in New Orleans, a city in the South. Last year, Ruby went to a school only for black children. White children went to their own schools. That had been the law in the South for a long time. Now that law changed. People said it was not fair to keep children apart because of the color of their skin. Today, Ruby was going to the white children's school nearby. She was going to be the first black child there. She would be the only black child there, too. Many people were not happy about that. They planned to make trouble. Ruby, I love you, said Ruby's dad. Then he sighed deeply. But I do not think she should go, he said to Ruby's mom. I will be okay, Dad, said Ruby, giving his hand a squeeze. Ruby's mom looked at her brave little girl. She sighed deeply too. Then she said, Ruby needs to go to that school today. She will learn a lot. And after she goes to school with white children, other black children might do the same. Her voice did not crack now. Ruby and her mom went to school with some man. The man's job was to keep Ruby safe. A lot of people stood outside the school. They did not want Ruby to go inside. They shouted mean things about Ruby. Ruby went up the steps. She smoothed her dress. She went inside. Ruby and her mom stayed in the office all day. People seemed mad, but there was no trouble. The next day was different. People outside the school still shouted mean things. Inside the school, however, a smiling woman met Ruby. Good morning, Ruby, she said. Welcome. I am your teacher, Mrs. Henry. Mrs. Henry was from Boston, a city in the north. White children and black children there went to school together. Mrs. Henry believed that people should not be separated. She was the only teacher in Ruby's school who would teach a black student. Mrs. Henry knew she would have a hard job. She called it a long haul. Are you ready to cross a bridge with me, Ruby Neal Bridges? She asked. Yes, ma'am, said Ruby. Mrs. Henry took Ruby by the hand. They went into the classroom together. To Ruby's surprise, the room was empty. Where are the other children? She asked. It's not easy for people to change, Mrs. Henry told Ruby. Some of the people don't know any better, and they are afraid. But not everyone is like that. Come, let's learn. Ruby and Mrs. Henry read together. They did math. At recess, Ruby stayed in the classroom. She played games with Mrs. Henry. It wasn't safe for Ruby to go outside and play with the other children. Back home, Ruby told her dad there was no trouble today either. I want to go back tomorrow. Weeks, then months went by. People still stood outside the school. They still shouted, but there was never any trouble. Ruby made it through first grade. She learned a lot, as her mother had said. Thank you for crossing that long bridge with me, Ruby, said Mrs. Henry. Mrs. Henry went back to Boston. Ruby went to second grade. She had a new teacher and classmates. No one stood outside the school and shouted mean things anymore.